Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan and we're back with the David story, Shepherd, Father, King, and we're on to Lecture 8 today, The Shepherd of Israel.
Lecture 7 is a tough one. The fourfold consequences of David's actions that he, in a way, foretold himself when he was talking to the prophet Nathan started to come to bear, and they conclude at the beginning of Lecture 8 with the death of Absalom. Absalom was anticipating victory in his rebellion against David. And really, we should take a step back. We talked about putting ourselves in the shoes of the characters in the narrative last time. And we can do that again and really have a little empathy or pity, or at least understand what Absalom was getting after. The king is supposed to do justice. The complaint that the Israelites had about Eli's sons at the beginning of this course was that they weren't doing their job. They weren't judging. They weren't providing justice. And that's the claim that Absalom levels against David. No justice for Tamar. No justice for himself. He murdered his brother, and he wanted at least some reckoning. He says, if I need death, put me to death. But David does nothing except gives him the kiss of redemption. And so Absalom says, maybe we need a king who will do justice, and starts publicly proclaiming that at the gates of the city.
And I like that you mentioned for the last episode that it took, this is a timeline of 7 years in which David allows these injustices to go unpunished, both as a king and as a father. And so, yes, we can look at Absalom and say, well, maybe he should be king because maybe he will bring justice. And like you said, that's what the people and probably God also demands, justice.
That's right. So the justice will come in a rather shocking and unsavory way. What's interesting in Professor Jackson's instruction on this course is in Lecture 7, he says one of the rules of 1st and 2nd Samuel is don't cross Joab. And Professor Jackson then says in Lecture 8, another one of the rules is don't underestimate David. Because Absalom and his forces have put David on the run. It's David hiding again, as he did when Saul was persecuting him. But when David seems to be down for the count is when he often comes back. Absalom hasn't learned this lesson. He's riding on a mule, which Professor Jackson points out is a sign of victory. A victorious king would ride in to the conquered city on a mule. Absalom is already riding a mule before the battle starts. And when he's retreating from the rout, David's men are routing what the text calls the army of Israel. His luxurious, heavy, seemly hair gets caught in the terebinth tree. He's suspended, and he watches the mule walk away, which is symbolic of his grasp over the kingdom walking away.
And, I encourage you guys to look up, there's beautiful artwork on this scene, I think. And if you go to the course and watch the lecture in this scene, we've picked some artwork because it's just incredible to see this picture of Absalom getting caught in the tree from his hair, and the mule, which is the symbol of victory, going away from him as he's caught in the tree. It's just incredible.
In our intro to Lecture 7, we had some criticisms of David and foreshadowed the redemption story, but we have to level one more criticism at David before we get to the redemption. David has had a very passive attitude towards the consequences of his sin, not providing justice to Tamar, not punishing Amnon, not either punishing or fully reconciling with Absalom. And now he tells Joab and his army, as they go out to fight Absalom's army, not to harm Absalom. But Joab, seizing the opportunity, murders Absalom when he is hanging by his hair from the tree. And yet David does not bring full justice against Joab. In fact, when he demotes Joab for murdering Absalom, Joab murders his replacement, and King David does not take any action against Joab. He leaves it to his son Solomon to finally execute this ambitious and traitorous, murderous man, Joab.
Yeah, and in fact, David starts weeping for the loss of his son and mourning the death of his son as is expected, but, we've talked about the tension between the personal and the political earlier on, and then we see it again. Of course, he was fighting his son, so as king, he should celebrate his victory over his son, And obviously, a lot of his men fought and many died, and so they should be celebrating the victory. But at the same time, he's mourning his death. And it's actually Joab, the one that comes to confront him and rebukes him and said, look at your troops. You need to celebrate. You need to encourage them because they were just victorious against your enemy.
Yeah. Joab accuses King David of bringing shame upon his troops. And as Professor Jackson says, it's pretty difficult when you're put in the position of agreeing with Joab, with all the bad character traits that we've just described and that we see come out in the lectures. But yes, just as one can feel some pity for Absalom, one can agree with Joab that the king was being remiss. And in the tension between the personal and political, it's interesting that the redemption arc takes the form of David exercising his political duty, whereas he did not intercede on behalf of his children for the consequences of his sin. He does intercede on behalf of the Israelites. They're being punished, and there's a messenger, a mysterious messenger, who is doling out the punishments. And David says, "Don't punish my people. They are blameless. They're sheep in my protection. Punish me for my sins." That completes David's redemption arc as he again assumes his rightful duty as the king to protect his people.
And then in the end, I love how Dr. Jackson ends the lecture because he points out, he actually goes into First Kings. So most of what we've been covering so far in the David story has been First and Second Samuel. But the first two chapters of First Kings, it's sort of like the end of the David story. And he goes into David's final words of wisdom, which are not a political strategy, but it's a message of keep the commandments. Actually, the verse is 1 Kings 2, and I think it's verse 4. If your sons keep their way to walk before me in truth with their whole heart and with their whole being, no man of yours will be cut off from the throne of Israel. And like we said in the last lecture, it was the same thing with the judges, right? If the judges were keeping the commands of the Lord, then things would go well for them and for Israel. If they went away from that, then problem would follow. And it's the same thing here with David as king. And David recognizes that at the end of this whole tragic story and gives that same advice to Solomon as the new king: keep the commands.
That is an excellent selection to read. And to close out our introduction, Juan, you're reading from our study guide for Lecture 8, The Shepherd of Israel.
Yeah, and we have study guides for all the lectures in this course, and a lot of our newer courses all have study guides. And if you go to hillsdale.edu/course, that's hillsdale.edu/course, you can download all of the 8 study guides for the David story. The study guides have some suggested readings from 1st and 2nd Samuel or 1st Kings. It has an outline of the lecture with timestamps where Professor Jackson covers the different topics in the lecture, and it also has some key passages and some discussion questions. So if you want to have basically in paper an outline of the entire course, you can go and print all those 8 study guides for you, and you can review those to remind yourself of the story in the future. So go to hillsdale.edu/course to download those. Now let's turn to Dr. Jackson in the last lecture of the David story, Lecture 8, Shepherd of Israel.
In our last lecture, we saw that Absalom had won over the hearts of the people by promising them all justice. David and his men must flee in order to avoid this danger. They are in straits. They are in a bad way. In chapter 17, Absalom turns to his advisor, Ahithophel. Ahithophel tells him, you got to be careful when you're dealing with David. He and his men are hard, strong men. As we saw in 1 Samuel, David's a scrapper. David can get through anything. He will disguise himself. He plays tricks. He's an excellent survivor. Ahithophel knows this. And he gives Absalom a certain piece of advice as to how to go after David. But David had prayed to God, deliver me from my enemies. Make it so that they won't catch me. And so God makes it so that they don't listen to Ahithophel's advice. Absalom takes another man's advice. Everything is going to go wrong for them. Ahithophel ends up killing himself because his advice wasn't taken. And now the tides have turned for David. David now has the advantage, in many ways, thanks to God for delivering him out of the hands of Absalom for not listening to Ahithophel. And where I want to pick up now is that they have Absalom right where they want him. They're about to go into battle. David's men have the advantage. And David runs out to them. First he asks, "Shall I sally forth with you?" And they tell David, "No, please stay back." But he has final words for his men as they go into battle. David charges Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for me with the lad Absalom." Sit on that for a moment. Deal gently for me with the lad Absalom. Absalom, who is rebelled against his father, who's a traitor, who if he had David, I imagine he wouldn't hesitate to kill him, to become king. I don't question that. But look at David's line. Deal gently with the lad Absalom. And all the troops heard when the king charged the commanders concerning Absalom. And the troops sallied forth to the field to meet Israel. And the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. And the troops of Israel were routed there by David's servants. And great was the slaughter there, 20,000. And the battle spread out over the countryside, and the forest devoured more of the troops than the sword devoured on that day. And Absalom chanced to be in front of David's servants, Absalom riding on his mule. And the mule came under the tangled branches of a great terebinth. And his head caught in the terebinth, he dangled between heaven and earth, while the mule which was beneath him passed on. It's this magnificent scene. Everything just perfect here. A few details we have to pay attention to. The very thing that Absalom is noted for with his beauty, really with his masculinity, his hair, 5 pounds a year he can grow, is the thing which gets tangled in the tree, and it has him dangling. There it says, between heaven and earth. And as he's riding on his mule, the mule goes out from underneath of him. But the mule that he's riding, this is supposed to be an indication of his kingly rule. Kings ride on mules. But not initially. A king rides on a mule after victory has been had. A king rides into a territory. It is a sign of strength, but also of peace. So just think about what that means for Absalom. He was already riding on a mule. He's already assumed the victory was going to be his. And this is where he gets caught. In other words, I suppose if one of the rules of 1st and 2nd Samuel is don't cross Joab, I think a second rule is never underestimate David. He always seems to find a way out. Again, with the help of God, he always seems to find a way out. And here we see it really, really just beautifully. So what Absalom gets to see as he's dangling is literally the symbol of his kingship is just walking away from him, paying no attention at all whatsoever. And a certain man saw and informed Joab and said, "Look, I saw Absalom dangling from the terebinth." And Joab said to the man, informing him, "And look, you saw, and why did you not strike him to the ground there? And I would have had to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." And the man said to Joab, "Even were I to heft in my palms 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For within our hearing the king charged you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Watch for me over the lad Absalom. Otherwise I would have wrought falsely with my own life, and nothing can be concealed from the king, while you would have stood aloof.' And Joab said, 'Not so will I wait for you.' And he took 3 sticks in his palm, and he thrust them into Absalom's heart, still alive in the heart of the terebinth. And 10 lads, Joab's armor bearers, pulled round and struck down Absalom and put him to death. And Joab sounded the ram's horn, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the troops. And they took Absalom and flung him into the big hollow in the forest, and they heaped over it a very high mound of stones. And all Israel had fled, each to his tent. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run, pray, and bear tidings to the king that the Lord has done him justice against his enemies." You can see poor Ahimaaz, he sees this only in political terms, that the rebellion has been crushed, that David shall be king again, that his enemies have been overthrown. Little does he know, this is the beloved son Absalom who did. This is not, what would I say? This is not David's enemy, Absalom. This is David's life, Absalom. And Joab said to him, "You are no man of tidings this day. You may bear tidings on another day, but this day you shall bear no tidings, for the king's son is dead." And Joab said to the Cushite, "Go, inform the king of what you have seen." And the Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. And Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, once again said to Joab, "Whatever may be, let me too pray run after the Cushite." And Joab said, "Why should you run, my son, when yours are not welcome tidings?" Joab understands exactly what's going on here. He knows what David's response is going to be. Joab for as treacherous as he has a keen eye for all things political. He's trying to save Ahimaaz. He's trying to save his hide. He knows David is not going to be happy. "Whatever may be, I will run." And he said to him, "Run." And Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and he overtook the Cushite. And David was sitting between the gates, and the lookout went up to the roof of the gate on the wall, and he raised his eyes, and look, a man was running alone. And the lookout called and told the king, and the king said, "If he's alone, there are tidings in his mouth." And he came on, drawing near, and the lookout saw another man running, and the lookout called to the gatekeeper and said, "Look, a man is running alone." And the king said, "This one too bears tidings." And the lookout said, "I see the running of the first one is the running of Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man, and with good tidings he must come." And Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." And he bowed down to the king, his face to the ground. And he said, and this is just one of my favorite scenes, "Blessed is the Lord your God, who has delivered over the men who raised their hand against the Lord my king." And the king said, "Is it well with the lad Absalom?" Oh, here you're bringing good tidings. The rebellion has been crushed. Your enemy has been killed. And the only thing the king can say after we've bowed down to the ground, bringing these great tidings of victory, "Is it well with the lad Absalom?" This is David's key concern. And as much as I love Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible and think the world of it, this is probably my favorite part of all of his translation. And Ahimaaz said, "I saw a great crowd to send the king's servant Joab and your servant, and I know not what." It's completely jumbled, as it is in the biblical Hebrew, and Alter left it at this, and it makes perfect sense. Here you are bringing great tidings to the king, telling him that his foes have been crushed. You should be greeted with cheer and applause. And instead, is it well with the lad Absalom? And Ahimaaz has no idea how to respond to this, so he responds with gibberish. "I saw a great crowd to send the king's servant Joab and your servant, I know not what." This is all one could say. And the king said, "Turn aside, stand by. He wants news of what's happened." And he turned aside and took his place, and look, the Cushite had come, and the Cushite said, "Let my lord the king receive tidings that the Lord has done you justice against all who rose against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the lad Absalom?" And the Cushite said, "May the enemies of my lord the king be like the lad, and all who have risen against you for evil." In short, Absalom has been killed. Absalom is dead, and David knows it. And the Cushite does not mince his words at all whatsoever. It's straightforward. And even using the language, "May the enemies of the Lord the king be like the lad." Just imagine those lines, how David must hear them. That his son Absalom is an enemy, right, of the Lord the king. That the Lord has delivered him that day. If the Lord has delivered him, if he's an enemy of the Lord, my king. And then David bears this responsibility for this. He gets to see the curse come to fruition. That, in short, the scandal of all of this is what we're ready to see here, is that all those questions of the political have melted aside. David is no longer David the king. I know it's impossible to separate these two, but in this moment, David is no longer David the king. This is David the father. This is David the father who bears responsibility for his children. Precisely everything that David had done. This is exactly what Nathan had prophesied. Even more to the point, it's exactly the curse that David had called upon himself in the prophecy of Nathan, the parable of Nathan. And the king was shaken. And he went up to the upper room over the gate, and he wept. And thus he said as he went, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died in your stead. Absalom, my son, my son." And it was told to Joab, "Look, the king is weeping, and he is grieving over Absalom." And the victory on that day turned into mourning for all the troops. And the troops had heard on that day, saying, "The king is pained over his son." And the troops stole away on that day to come to the town, as troops disgraced in their flight from the battle would steal away. And the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "My son Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son." And Joab came to the king within the house and said, "You have today shamed all your servants who have saved your life today, and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives, and the lives of your concubines, to those who hate you and to those who love you. For you have said today that you have no commanders or servants. For I know today that were Absalom alive and all of us today dead, that it would have been right in your eyes. And now rise, go out, and speak to the heart of your servants. For by the Lord I have sworn, if you go not out, that not a man shall spend the night with you. And this will be a greater evil for you than any evil that has befallen you from your youth until now." And the king arose and sat in the gate, and all the troops they told, saying, "Look, the king is sitting in the gate." And the troops came before the king, while Israel had fled, each man to his tent. Now this is a harrowing confrontation that we have here. "Absalom, O Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died in your stead." This is the language of a father responsible for his son. And the true torment here, I think, in all of this, is that it's also King David. And as treacherous as Joab may be throughout the entire text, he's not wrong here. When he says, "You would prefer that we all died as opposed to your son Absalom," I don't know that that's true. But what he's saying is that's the effect of it, that you have turned victory into defeat. In short, King David, not Father David, but King David is now victorious over his foes. Father David, there is no victory or defeat here. There can only be defeat. There can only be defeat. Even if Absalom had lived, there would still be animosity. There would still be rebellion. But David is beholden. He is faithful to his son. What would I like to say? I would say David the shepherd sees in Absalom that one lost sheep, and he desires to go after him. And Joab, politically astute, tells him that is not the political thing to do. You pay attention to the 99 and not to the one. And as a reader, we're put in a horribly uncomfortable position. And honestly, I don't know how to resolve it, because Joab's not wrong. It's at least what I can say about Joab. He's not wrong. But David is absolutely right in the mourning of his child. Would that I had died in your stead. I think David feels that to the very fiber of his being. Just go back to when his infant dies, and what does he say? He's not coming back to me, I'm going to him. David has seen all of this death after his time with Bathsheba and Uriah, and he's responsible for it. So we're caught in this horrible position. On the one hand, we want to, at least I sympathize with David. When he says, would that I died in your stead, I'm a father. I would say that all the time, no matter how much my children have betrayed me. I would die in their stead. I understand what David's going through. This is perhaps one of the highest, most articulate ethical pronouncements we're going to see in the Hebrew Bible. I would die in place of the man who has betrayed me because in some sense I am responsible for that man. And yet simultaneously I'm king of all these people. And now you're stuck with this because if you sit there and you say, David, you're wrong, why are you mourning, etc., which by the way, perfectly acceptable position. But what you're saying is you side with Joab. That's not a very comfortable position to be in 1st and 2nd Samuel. To take up Joab's position, this man who calculates things politically to his own advantage. He can only think not just of saving his neck, but how to profit from things. When I'm willing to say he's not wrong, I am in a very difficult position as a reader. And I love that the text does it to us. This is the ultimate confrontation of saying it can be fun to think, oh, we have the political over here with the king and the familial over here with just David the father, the human being, but we can't separate those things. We don't get to read it in this hermetically sealed, bifurcated way. David is both, he's father and king. And perhaps this is the horror. If we want to go all the way back to 1 Samuel, maybe this is the horror that Samuel didn't remind anybody of, is that your king is a human being with frailty and children and ethical responsibilities beyond anything that has to do with the political. That what you're going to ask your king to do is have to choose between a kingdom and his own family. What is his responsibility to his kingdom and to his army, to his soldiers, to his citizens? And what is his fidelity? In some ways, not political fidelity, but an unspeakable bond that's there with his children, especially when David knows he bears responsibility for everything that Absalom has done because of what he did with Uriah. That's the position David is in. And again, I would challenge you, find me a piece of literature that does something like this in such a concentrated way.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
2 Samuel chapter 19, verses 1 through 9. In 9 verses, this is what we get. After the death of Absalom, after the defeat of David's enemies, David must now go about trying to rebuild the kingdom, trying to unify his citizens one more time. He decides to part ways with Joab and gives the leadership position to Amasa. And it shouldn't surprise us what Joab does. He grabs Amasa by the beard and he assassinates him. He stabs him. As soon as he sees that power going away from him, Joab will step up and try to regain that control and that power. We understand that Joab is a political problem for David. As much as he's helped David in his reign, he's now a true political problem as David is trying to rebuild things here. And as we get to chapters 21 to 24, the very end of 2 Samuel, we are given we are given 4 chapters here that are a bit of an anomaly. Critics aren't always quite too sure what to do with these. Some critics will see chapters 21 to 24 as a sort of appendix to the text, giving us events that happened earlier or even maybe chronologically going along with the events that have happened. I see chapter 21 and 24 as a sort of recapitulation, this sort of microcosm of what we've seen in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and especially 2nd Samuel, the rule of David. What we get in chapter 21 is David with his men, with his warriors, standing side by side. Standing with his warriors means you get to see the external David. How does David go out in the world? Chapters 22 and chapters 23 are Psalms of David, which makes sense. We get the interior David, which is what we've gotten throughout, and especially within the Psalmic tradition. It plays right into that. We get to see the interior David. So 21 and also 24 is the exterior David. It is David who's going to have to intercede on behalf of his people. So chapter 21 and 24 are these bookends of David as he exists on the exterior, going outside of himself. Chapters 22 and 23 are songs of David, sort of this interior vision as to what he is going through and has gone through much of his life. But what I'd like to turn our attention to is the very end of chapter 24. Israel is being harassed, attacked by the Lord, a messenger of God. We are told in verse 16, the messenger reached out his hand against Jerusalem to destroy it. And the Lord regretted the evil and said to the messenger who was sowing destruction among the people, enough, now stay your hand. And the Lord's messenger was at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And David said to the Lord when he saw the messenger who was striking down the people, thus he said, and this is what's so important here, it is I who offended, I who did wrong. Here's the line, and these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand be against me and my father's house. Just want to stop there. And the reason why I want to pick up on this is because as the messenger comes, what is David willing to do on behalf of his people? He steps in and he intercedes for them. And he says, whatever has gone wrong, bring it on to me. This is his kingly version of Absalom, oh my Absalom, would that I had died in your stead. I think David here has grown beyond just the parental, personal, in taking on that ethical responsibility just for his son to be able to step in and say, even for these people. Not only that, but what does he call them? And these sheep, that's not an insult to them. If we go back to chapter 5, verse 2, if we go back to all of 2 Samuel, what is David being told he is? He's the shepherd of his people. This is the very definition of what it means to be a king. Chapter 24, this bookend, then what do we get to see David doing? He's getting to be that ethical king. He's taken on the wood that I had died in their stead, and he steps in for his people, the sheep. He's doing precisely what a king ought to have been doing the entire time. This, you want to see David the king? I give you David the king here. And these sheep saying, I'm that shepherd. Let your hand be against me and my father's house. In other words, let me be punished in their stead. The very thoughts that he offers to Absalom, he now sees those as his own people here. And Gad came to David on that day and said to him, go up, raise to the Lord an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. And there, I think there's a play etymologically. Aran in Hebrew is ark. And I think what the text is doing is it's giving a nod. He's saying, go build an altar, give us a shrine, with that notion of ark, because of course, what is ultimately going to hold the ark? But the temple. But what do we know with David? He's been told, you shall not build a temple for me. But in this final chapter, what is he allowed to do? He's allowed to build this ark. He's allowed to build this shrine. And in some ways, it is a beautiful bookend. I mean, just think about everything that's encompassed in this final scene. David standing in for his people as their shepherd, as he calls them the sheep. Let me be punished in their stead. Rather than being punished, David, build for me an altar. You can't build a temple, but build for me an altar. And we end 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, even though in the ancient world they would have been seen as one book, not 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, one long book. This is how meticulous our authors are. That we began the entire book at the shrine in Shiloh with Hannah and Eli. That's where we began. And we end the book of 2 Samuel at a shrine, but this time it's that which David gets to build for the Lord as a sort of substitute for the temple which he will not be able to build. And as nice as it would be to end the David story there at the end of 2 Samuel, because one would think, well, this is the end of the David story, since it's the end of 2 Samuel, I don't think the David story ends there. Rather, the David story ends at the 2nd chapter of 1 Kings. And why does it end? Because now we get to see Solomon, David's son, take over. We get to see the death of David. And perhaps most importantly, we get to see Solomon make quick work of all of David's political problems. It's really mind-boggling to see how quickly Solomon takes care of these things. But there are a couple of final images I want us to end with. The first one is 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. And King David had grown old, advanced in years, and they covered him with bedclothes, but he was not warm. And his servant said to him, let them seek out for my lord the king a young virgin, that she may wait upon the king and become his familiar, and lie in your lap, and my lord the king will be warm. Notice here the lie in his lap is exactly the language used in the parable that Nathan gives to David with the ewe. In some ways, I suppose one could see this as some sort of sad scene of a pathetic old man who's utterly impotent, and he has a young woman brought to him to warm him. Okay, that's fine, I suppose. But it can also be, I think, something of an image of redemption. The young woman with whom David will not have any relations at all, who is simply that little ewe in his lap to provide him warmth and comfort here in his old age. As we get here to the end of the David story, I love to turn to chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 2, you get the religious thesis of the story. And I love that it comes here at the very end of the David story. And by the way, 1 and 2 King, we still have political intrigue. Solomon's going to take care of it. Still the question of who's going to be king. May I have my father's concubine? All of this sort of thing. Solomon takes care of it very quickly. Solomon takes care of Joab. He kills Joab, who's holding onto the altar. Solomon's words are simple. Go kill him. Go take him out. There, 2 chapters, the Joab problem is done and over with. You see, the political problems of the David story are done in the first 2 chapters. But inside of all of this political intrigue, or what we think is political intrigue, is really the simple thesis, I think, of the entire David story. Chapter 2, verse 2. David says, I am going on the way of all the earth, and you must be strong and be a man, and keep what the Lord your God enjoins, to walk in his way, to keep his statutes, his commands, and his dictates, and his admonitions, as it is written in the teaching of Moses, so that you may prosper in everything you do and everything to which you turn, so that the Lord may fulfill his word that he spoke unto me, saying, if your sons keep their way and walk before me in truth, with their whole heart and with their whole offering, no man of yours will be cut off from the throne of Israel. To keep the Lord's commands. David's final words of wisdom are not political. It's not political wisdom. There's no strategy here. It's simply the words of a faithful man. He actually knows what happens when one doesn't follow the commandments of God. It's put inside of a narrative where David gets to reflect on his entire life, his pain, his hurt. I think ultimately what he comes to understand with regards to his ethical responsibility to his children, to his people. And he understands it's actually a really simple answer to all of these problems. Follow the Lord and his command and all of the teachings of the law. And it's that basic and it's that simple. Despite all of the different political machinations we have, the way in which Solomon has to clean up all of the political problems of David's rule. I love the final line of chapter 2 because what we see in this final line is really beautiful. And the kingdom was unshaken in Solomon's hand. This is precisely the promise that God gives to David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 13. That in fact, this is God's promise to David. Whatever disaster we see happen to David and to David's family, we know that God remains faithful. This is what we were told when we go all the way back to 1 Samuel. Whenever they wanted a king and the thing seemed evil in the eyes of the Lord and said it was a mistake, and what did he say? Nevertheless, I'll do for you what you ask. It's going to bring you pain, and we've seen the pain that it brings. But what did he say? Nevertheless, I won't leave you. That I will be there, howsoever I will be there. Thank you for joining me for this course on the David story. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed sharing these various insights with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning about the David story or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.